Okay, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Dave. My name's CraigPurnell, and I'm here to talk to you this evening about, it started out really as 10 tips towards better SQL Server security. And this was done for the first time at the ISC Squared meeting back in, I believe it was July or August. And, but actually, I'll tell you, it has evolved. There's actually 15 tips that are actually in here that we're going to cover tonight. So it's kind of, we're getting the jumbo version. All right, so a little bit about myself. I'm a database guy. I'm currently, I'm a professional DBA. I've been in IT for about 15 years. And I'm currently working as a consultant at a small health insurance company down in Canton called AltCare. And I also, all of my background is in database infrastructure, back office ERP systems, really the mission critical stuff that has to stay functioning or the business is losing money or can't function. I'm also a very avid speaker at community events. I'm a member of the local Cleveland SQL Server user group here. And I'm also have presented at the Information Security Summit this year. And I also delivered a pre-con at that event as well, specifically on SQL Server security. I've been working with SQL Server for about 12 years. And let me tell you a story. The story goes a little bit like this. Right when I was first starting out in my IT career, I was kind of starting to get into it and trying to find out my niche, and I was interested in getting involved in security. I've always been interested in security, okay? And so I wanted to do the various certifications, the CISSP, and you guys probably know way more about the certifications than I do. And the certified ethical hackers and all that. And I read a few books and stuff, but what happened to me was basically I became an involuntary DBA or an accidental DBA. I kind of just fell into the SQL Server world and started working with databases. So here I am, and then about a year or so ago, I suddenly kind of got more interested in security as a result of my working at the healthcare company. And I'm now subject to HIPAA and some of these compliance topics, which is obviously a really big deal these days. And HIPAA is not the only one. There are a lot of other regulatory compliance that we're all subject to as IT professionals. So that kind of got me interested in kind of light my fire again with security. And my friend Gary Sheehan, he's in the back there. He and I have had some discussions about what this might look like, this synergy between the database world, the SQL Server world, and the security community, the people who consider themselves security professionals, how to deliver training to them and educate them on how to secure your SQL Server infrastructure, and how to, as security professionals, how to have conversations with your DBA team, how to talk about some of the things that live inside of the SQL Server world. It's not a black box. There's lots of bells and whistles and gauges that can be turned on and off inside of the world. And hopefully I'm going to share some of that with you tonight. We're not going to go really into any detail. This talk is really kind of a summary of the content that I delivered for the pre-con for the Information Security Summit. So we're going to kind of stay at 30,000 feet just to get you acquainted with some of these features. All right, there's my contact information as well. All right, so let's do a survey. So who in the room is security professionals doing something with security? Okay, most of you. Okay, very nearly all. Any DBAs in the room? No. Okay, that's good. Managers? A couple of you managers. Okay, auditors or compliance professionals? Okay, a couple of you. Security consultants? Okay. Any developers in the room? Any developers? All right, I'm going to pick on you later.
I'll pick back.
Okay. But yes, I just got to kind of get an idea where everybody's at here. So, all right, so probably if you think of SQL Server, you probably start to snicker, right? SQL Server security, at least in some people's minds, used to be a joke, right? And I'm talking 10, 12 or more years ago, right? Right, the SQL Slammer worm, and the SQL Spider worm, which is actually was actually a byproduct of blank SA password. Microsoft didn't enforce putting in an administrator password on the default install. Now, obviously shame on Microsoft for that, and that's obviously been fixed. But the result of that was the SQL Spider worm. So snicker, used to be a joke, right? But I had to go and actually look up. The SQL Slammer worm was over 11 years ago. And actually, almost 12. In January, it'll be 12 years since the slammer. And that was actually a buffer overrun. I had to go look it up because it's been so long. We've come a long way with SQL Server Security. And I'm going to kind of talk about some of the things that I look at and that I have seen has improved over the years as a professional DBA and having worked with SQL Server for many, many years. So really kind of the first thing that I kind of started looking at was the CVE vulnerability list. And where does SQL Server live in that? So I went over to the website a while back, and basically I looked at just looking at grand totals here. Okay, CVEs, obviously the vulnerabilities for both severe and minor things. I'm looking at just grand totals for the entire time, grand total. So I was kind of surprised with that. Frankly, I figured SQL Server was going to be somewhere in the middle. So let's take a look here. So I was really surprised here. DB2, 99. And what I will say here is I'm only looking at commercial relational database platforms, okay, that you can buy. I'm not looking at NoSQL solutions. I'm not looking at mainframe or any of that. I'm only looking at things that you actually pay for. And I'm also not going to look at MySQL because that's an open source database. Yes, you can buy support for MySQL, but I'm looking at basically closed source relational platforms. So the third one was Oracle. So I was completely shocked when I saw those numbers. I figured, the perception is that Oracle is a secure a platform, and I'm seeing some shaking some heads here. At least in my mind, think, oh, Oracle, enterprise software, enterprise database. So, pardon me? It's an enterprise whole. But let me offer maybe a little bit of insight into why I think this might be the case.
That's Oracle databases? So is that all Oracle products?
That's just the database server platform, 8i, 10G, specifically, not the Office suites or anything like that. And I'm not obviously not a database developer. I don't write database platforms, okay? But maybe I can give you a little bit of insight as to why I think these numbers are where they're at. Okay, so if you look at the history of DB2 and Oracle, a lot older than SQL Server. Over the years, they have been written to run on virtually every platform, right? Mainframe, VAX, Unix boxes, various other platforms. DB2 runs on the mainframe as well, runs on AS400, runs on just about everything. So if you look at, in the database world, to keep track of transactions and things like threads and scheduling of jobs and workloads, you have to build this very complicated layer to keep track of this stuff, okay? So Oracle and DB2, being platforms that had to be all things to all men, it had to run on everything, are, in my opinion, a lot more complicated than SQL Server, which is, in my opinion, a lot simpler. SQL Server was ported from day one to run on Windows NT. Actually, technically it ran on OS2. Then the first real version of SQL Server ran on the first versions of Windows NT. So what they did was they took advantage of a lot of the native features that are built right into the Windows operating system to make things a lot simpler. So I'm offering up as a possible suggestion or explanation as to why SQL Server is maybe a little bit lower than these other platforms. So, what I have seen, most security issues that I have seen are due to misconfiguration of the database platform in some way, shape, or form, whether that be maybe an accidental DBA or maybe as a system administrator and just kind of works with SQL Server part-time or something like that, or bad application design by third-party applications. I've seen a lot of bad applications in my time, a lot of bad things done to SQL Server, and then unfortunately SQL Server gets blamed for it. So yeah, that's really been kind of my experience or what I've seen. So let's start off. Let's talk about the first one. This is number one. Microsoft obviously is a big proponent of Windows authentication. Let's talk about ways that we can authenticate into SQL Server first of all. Okay. First of all, we can use Windows authentication. Okay, where I connect in and SQL Server calls the domain controller up on the phone and says, hey, is this CraigPurnell guy who he says he is? And then the DC says, yeah, he is. You can trust him, and then let him in. Okay. The other way we can use authentication is what's known as mixed mode, or SQL Server and Windows authentication. We can use both, either or. And what happens there is, in mixed mode, we configure SQL Server, and it stores usernames and passwords actually in the master, the main system database, encrypted, of course. But in this technology, this mode of authentication has been around since the dawn of time, really since SQL Server was first built. Now, most DBAs, most compliance authorities say you should never, ever, ever use mixed mode. Yes, that's true, but usually in the DBA world, there's usually an answer of it depends. There's always not. There's ways you can configure SQL Server. So let's talk about how can we configure SQL Server to get almost as good as Windows authentication. Starting with SQL Server 2005, running on Windows Server 2003, it is exposed to SQL Server. There are special APIs, and the name of them escapes me, but they allow SQL Server to mimic Windows authentication in terms of enforcing password policy and enforcing password expiration. So we can configure SQL Server to do this, starting with SQL Server 2005. And hopefully you're not running Server 2003, and obviously Server 2003 and newer. Gives us the ability to do that. Now, but the problem with this approach is, what if the application doesn't support Windows authentication? Okay, what if the application says, "Oh, I have to have username and password as a service account or to get into the system"? But also, even worse, what if the application doesn't support password expiration? What if it doesn't support password policy? Okay, I've seen a lot of third-party applications that can't do this, which is very unfortunate. Also, the other thing is to understand your DBA. If your DBAs don't enforce this, the functionality is there, built into SQL Server, but your DBA team has to use it. Okay, it's actually 2 checkboxes on the login box to say enforce password policy, enforce password expiration. So that's a conversation you can have with your DBA team. One other thing that I will also mention when it comes back to the it depends is there's a feature called policy-based management, or PBM, that's really way beyond the scope of this talk. But think of it as group policy for SQL Server. Okay, you can configure SQL Server to monitor for the use of if I have a login, let's say I have a login called Lady Gaga. Okay, and I create the login and I don't have enforced password policy checked. I can have it scan my environment periodically and say, hey, you've got a login that's out of compliance. You can configure your environment to do that. Yeah, it's a little bit of work, but it's doable. So any questions on that? No. Okay, good. Another one, disable and rename SA. SA is equivalent to the administrator account in Windows. So as a result, it's probably the account that the bad guys are going to try to attack, because they know it. All they have to do is guess the password. This is easy, low-hanging fruit to rename the SA account. You can rename it to anything you want. I prefer SA, E-S-S-A-Y. You get the play on words there. So basically, anything that's not SA. And then finally, you can actually disable the account itself. And then finally, create a honeypot SA. Create an account called SA with no rights at all, just to be able to connect to the database engine, and then let the bad guys try to attack that. So this is low-hanging fruit. Data encryption. Obviously, Edward Snowden. There's a quote I grabbed off of one of the articles a while back, but the point he's trying to make is encryption's a big deal, and it helps us secure our data in today's modern world. And he wouldn't have been able, or I've read that he wouldn't have been able to get his data out of the NSA had it not been for self-signed certificates. But I don't know too many of those details, but I heard that somewhere. But understand, encryption, you've got lots and lots of options in SQL Server. Not only SQL Server tools, there's some Windows stuff that we're going to talk about here a little bit. So starting for the first time in SQL Server 2005, SQL Server brought us what's known as column-level encryption. So let's say I have a SSN number or credit card. Now, hopefully you're not storing credit card numbers in your database, but let's say use SSN for an example. You can configure that column to be then encrypted. Okay. The downside of that approach, and this still exists today, the downside of this approach is you have to have your application developers have to recode your application to be able to handle that inside of the client code. It's not something that you can just natively do in SQL Server. So there's obviously some work involved with that. And if you're using a third-party application, any third-party application that doesn't support that, sure, you can call them on the phone and say, hey, can you add this functionality? But it might be 2 years before you actually see it in the third-party application. So know that this is one of your tools in your toolkit. TDE was introduced in SQL Server 2008. TDE is short for Transparent Data Encryption. Basically, Microsoft recognized that, that the column level encryption, although good, may not always work in all cases, like in the third-party application software space. So the idea that we could just flip a switch and encrypt it in the entire database, okay, at rest. It encrypts the actual files on disk. Okay. Some other tools in your toolbox that you may want to consider. These are the Rex 2 or Windows-based, but BitLocker came out starting in the Vista Server 2008 timeframe. You can encrypt an entire volume on a server. Now, there are some pros and cons there. The most likely user and a real-world use case for BitLocker that I can think of is, let's say you've got a bunch of salesmen or salespeople running around in the world with laptops, and they've got a SQL Server database application on their laptop that has data about your company or what you sell, perhaps. You could encrypt their volumes with BitLocker in that scenario. EFS, or encrypting file system, is a little bit older. That goes back to the Windows 2000 days. The ability to encrypt specific files or folders at the file system level. Know that this is just another option that you have. Now, another one that's an interesting option is, especially if you develop your own applications in-house and you're a .NET shop, you can use .NET APIs. The encryption that SQL Server uses is exactly the same that's built into the .NET APIs. You can use those in let's say a middle tier scenario, like let's say you've got a web-based application or something like that. You can use encryption there so that by the time the data hits the database, it's already encrypted. Now, one of the hazards of that approach is then somebody's got to manage the encryption keys, right? Whether we let the DBAs manage it or we're going to let somebody else, maybe the security guys that control the middle tier servers or something, maybe the system administrators. Somebody, at the end of the day, somebody has to control those keys. And the other one that's actually come out in recent years, when I was doing my research, SAN level encryption. Talk to your SAN guys, and there's been some recent developments in this area in the past couple years. Both Emulex and QLogic HBAs, those are those special cards that plug into the servers that allow your server to talk to the SAN. There are encryption chips, ASICs, built right onto those cards that allow you to encrypt that data as it goes down to the SAN level. Other options available to, I believe they're called brocade switches, SAN switches, where you encrypt at the switch level down at the SAN layer. And then finally, which was another interesting one, there's actually some of the newer SAN vendors offer actual encryption ASICs actually on the drives themselves to be able to encrypt at the drive level. So there's a lot of different options there that you have available to you. And you can, it's probably not a one-size-fits-all. It's probably a mix and match a little bit. But know that it's not all SQL Server. But SQL Server does bring quite a bit to the table in this area. All right. Number 4, turning on auditing. For the first time in SQL Server 2008, auditing, the ability to do auditing really became a first-class citizen.
Correct.
Yes, sir.
Can you mix and match the encryptions?
The question was, can you mix and match the encryptions? I don't see why you couldn't. You could do column level encryption. In addition, you can do TDE. Just understand that it's all about levels of granularity. Any other questions? Okay. Auditing is functionality that was introduced for the first time in SQL 2008. It was an at that point, it was an Enterprise Edition feature only, which is unfortunate. That version that has the big hefty price tag. But starting with SQL Server 2012 and newer, on all editions across all versions, including the free Express version, you have the ability to do auditing at the server level. There's 2 levels of auditing inside a SQL Server. There's server level audit, which covers things at the instance level and other things about the server. And then we can do audits at the database level, which are basically inside of the database, like who's inserting this data into this table, or who's selecting from this table. Unfortunately, database level auditing is still an Enterprise Edition only feature, but Microsoft gave us server level audit across the board, which is good. Older versions of SQL Server, I bring this up because whenever I talk to DBAs about this, the conversation always comes up, hey, we've got older versions of SQL Server, in our environment. What do we do? What can we do to help? Excuse me. I'll do a quick poll. Anybody still running SQL 2005 in your environment? Okay, yeah, there's a few of you. Any SQL 2000? Oh, well, congratulations. Congratulations. Yeah, there's still 2000 in the real world. But I always like to bring these topics up because I realize that it's not as easy as just, hey, get into the latest version and turn on the nice new security features. And sometimes as IT professionals, we have to protect the older infrastructure as well. So you have some options in that area. Yes, they're not ideal, but something's better than nothing. That's the way I look at it. There's a technology called server-side trace that you can audit. There's a whole lot of auditing features and functionality that you can do as a server-side trace. Talk to your DBAs about that. Not optimal, but it's free. It is technically deprecated, but it's free. Also, you can use triggers, which is a piece of code that would run on an object or a table that keeps track of who selected from that or who inserted from that. Yeah, it's development work, it's work, and there is significant effort there, but it is something that you can do if you absolutely have to. On 2000, I'll just make one comment. On SQL 2000, there are some third-party products that you can potentially use. And also, and I'm not here to pitch anybody's products, but there are a lot of other products like Idera, GreenSQL. There's a lot of third-party tools out there that if you don't want to go with the native SQL Server solutions, they're available to you. I don't remember who the vendor is, but somebody has a security appliance. Basically, it's a box that sits in between your network, between your clients and your SQL servers, and it filters all traffic. It audits every call that's made into that database. Does anybody know who that is?
McAfee has one.
Okay, McAfee.
F5.
Yeah, F5. Okay. So those are some other options that are available to you if you want to go the hardware route. So there's no right or wrong answer here. So all right, let's talk about linked servers a little bit. Developers love linked servers, right? What is a linked server? Well, a linked server is an object inside of SQL Server that basically you can reference to point somewhere else, to another SQL Server somewhere else. Or not only SQL Server, I can reference DB2, I can reference Oracle, I can reference mainframes, anything with an ODBC driver on it I can connect to and conceivably query. But linked servers are an area that's subject to a lot of abuse in the real world. Check them for abuse. And what I mean by that is sometimes you will go and look at the linked server and you will actually see hard-coded logins in there. And obviously the password is encrypted inside of the master database. But let's say, for example, I have an administrative login to go connect to that other server. Well, guess what? If I connect using that linked server, everybody's connecting with the same credentials. So there's no credential auditing, no granular control there. That's why these can be dangerous. The double hop problem. If you're familiar with, who's heard of the double hop problem? Okay, a couple of you. What the double hop problem is it's actually not really a problem. It's really a feature of Windows. Under Windows NTLM authentication, Windows is not allowed to forward your credentials past one hop. Okay. the only way you can do that to forward it past that first hop where the second server sends your credentials on is by using Kerberos Authentication, which first appeared in Windows Server 2000. We're going to talk more about Kerberos in a minute. But by default, you have to configure for this. So the most likely scenario is, let's say I connect to a SQL server, and then I try to go connect to another SQL server. That's a double hop. Okay, SQL Server will not forward my Windows credentials, so my DBAs might hard code a SQL Server-based login to get to that second hop. So that's something else to watch for, is because the DBAs may not understand the double hop problem, so rather than fixing it, they just put a Band-Aid on it and use SQL authentication. Other things to watch for is linked servers being used in a DBA admin scenario. This is kind of a little bit outdated, but the scenario is, let's say I have a centralized management server. This is really pre-SQL 2008. I would basically build a bunch of linked servers to connect out and run query management type queries against my other SQL servers, just strictly for management operations, server management, that type of thing. But that can potentially be a scenario where you're passing credentials on that aren't your own. So reviewing logins. There are some scripts out there on a site called mssqltips.com. There's a section called Security and Compliance. There's probably about, 40 or 50 good articles out there that talk about a lot of what we're talking about here tonight. But there are a couple articles that actually have some specific scripts that you can run and audit and look at your logins and look at when was the last time this login connected in. This is kind of a variant of auditing. This is basically keeping track of my logins, who's connecting in, how often. And then also, you can, one scenario I have done in the past is run what's known as a server-side trace to basically just keep track of login, okay? And that's all I'm keeping track of. And then let that run for, say, a month, maybe 2 months, maybe a full business cycle, okay? And then export that out, dump it into Excel, and then do some statistical analysis on it. Just do group by and that type of thing to figure out who's connecting in and who isn't. And then disable those logins that aren't connecting in. Disable them. You can disable them without deleting them. And then if somebody calls you up and says, "Hey, why can't I log into SQL Server?" That's what I mean by political ramifications. Is if you maybe disable that login for that executive or whoever, they may be surprised when they can't connect. But definitely this is some technology. And I would say this also as a side effect of that, you might be really surprised who's connecting into your SQL servers if you do some auditing on just login activity for a period of time, a month or 2 months or quarterly or whatever. Check this stuff out. There are actually modern ways to do, a little bit more modern ways called extended events. That's really way beyond the scope of the discussion tonight, but extended events are built on the Windows Server 2008 extended event tracing infrastructure that became available starting in Server 2008. It's a lightweight way to do a trace. That's really the modern way. Also, let's talk about fixed server roles a little bit. A server role in SQL Server is roughly equivalent to a Windows group. Okay, but it only lives in SQL Server. So we put users into roles, like we would put users into groups, and then we can assign permissions to those roles. There are some roles called the fixed server roles. These are considered legacy, meaning they've been around in SQL Server since really the dawn of time, and understand that their use is strongly discouraged. However, there is a role called the sysadmin. That is roughly equivalent to the Windows administrators group in Windows. Okay, and a couple things that are to watch for. Always keep an eye on who's in your sysadmin group, because once SQL Server figures out that you're in the sysadmin role, all permission checking is turned off. They do not do any more permission checking. Also, they can get you fired. They can get your DBA team fired. They can drop a database on that finance system during month end. I mean, yeah, that's malicious. That probably wouldn't happen, but it's probably more likely that they might accidentally just delete some data by mistake. But even worse, they can get your CIO fired, right? So definitely keep an eye on who's in that group. And most often that I have seen in the wild, there's usually more people in that group than there needs to be. Very likely. Think of there's also a group called the security admin. Think of that as equivalent to sysadmin, because security admin plus privilege escalation means that if I'm in the security admin, I can add myself into any group. I can just add myself to the sysadmin group. So that's an example of privilege escalation. Auditors and compliance people, they usually have a real problem with the sysadmin because you can do basically anything you want. But you are subject to audit, but you can turn on and off the audit as needed. So understand that. I'll comment on, when I get into separation of duties, we're going to talk about user-defined server roles in the later versions of SQL Server and some of the power of that, which actually brings us to the next slide. Over on CodePlex, there is a free download that, yes, sir?
Can you turn those roles off at all, or you can just make sure no one's part of it?
The question was, can you turn off these roles? You cannot. You cannot. They're built into SQL Server, but you can monitor who's in those roles. And there are actually like 7 or 8 of them. I'm only mentioning these 2. The rest of them are a lot less important. Does that answer your question? Okay. Separation of duties is an interesting one. Separation of duties is actually relatively, it's been in the accounting world for a very, very long time. This idea that the person who actually takes the checks to the bank is not the same person who records, what the money was received, in our financial system. Okay, but these ideas of separation of duties, this is relatively new to the IT world, and even newer still into the SQL Server world. There's a project called Separation of Duties Framework out on CodePlex. It's a free download. It's a little bit older, but it's a great place to start about thinking about separation of duties and thinking about why I might not want my DBAs to be in the administrators group on the server. Okay? And likewise, starting for the first time in SQL Server 2008, there was a group called built-in administrators, which is the administrators group in Windows, used to be a member of the sysadmin in SQL Server. For the first time starting in SQL Server 2008, those 2 were separated. You no longer by default add those groups into each other. So that's a good thing. There's also a white paper on it from Microsoft. Just search on Separation of Duties Framework. This will kind of get you started. Starting in SQL Server 2012, and on obviously 2014, of course, there is a new feature called user-defined server roles, where I can basically roll my own server roles. I can create a role called high-level permission DBA, and this person can do lots of things inside of the instance. I can then have another role called maybe low permission DBA, who can only do certain things. Okay, and then what's even cooler is I can create a server role called auditors, and I can deny or grant auditors the ability to control the audit logging and the audit functionality, and then I can deny that to my DBAs. So only the auditor role can control the auditing infrastructure. So this is something that you should definitely look into if you're on some of the newer versions of SQL Server. Some good stuff, especially in a small organization. This isn't really as big of a deal, but if you're in a big organization, big IT organization, some of this stuff's probably already been put before you. And not necessarily with SQL Server, but with other stuff. Like, we separate our SAN admins from our security admins, right? And you're probably all familiar with that. XP Command Shell, this is an interesting one. Anybody who knows what XP Command Shell is? A few of you? Okay, good. This actually gives you the ability to obtain OS shell level access from within SQL Server. So I can say XP Command Shell dir c:\\, and I can run a dir command. Or I can do basically any Windows command that I have permissions to do. Nearly everybody in the world agrees that this is a massive security hole. And many of the compliance white papers specifically call it out and say, make sure that XP command shell is disabled on your servers. It's a massive security hole. I will say this. There are a handful of DBAs that I know. I won't mention names. There are a few of them that insist on using it. But I won't mention names. Now, I will. Now the next slide, this is going to be another one of these it depends, okay? So XP command shell today. 10 years ago, XP command shell was a big deal. I can tell you that as DBAs, we found it to be incredibly useful to be able to, from a server management perspective and keeping track of what's going on our servers. Stuff like keeping track of drive spaces, that type of thing. Even with its serious security issues. It was useful 10 years ago. Before, I'm talking pre-SQL 2005, okay? Now, today, not so much. I can't remember the last time I used XP command shell. Why? Because PowerShell and the new management tools that are designed for server management that Microsoft has brought to the table really in the last 5 to 6 years, like PowerShell, are very powerful. And another tool called the Central Management Server that's built into SQL Server. I can use that. Your DBAs can use that as a central management point to keep track of what's going on their SQL servers. So I can do all of the management stuff I need to do with PowerShell, or very nearly all the management stuff I need to do. Finally, the CLR, also known as the Common Language Runtime, was introduced for the first time in SQL Server 2005. What the CLR gives me the ability to do is I can write code or stored procedures or any kind of executable code inside of .NET, C# or VB, and I can load that object then into SQL Server and do things that connects to external platforms, like maybe I want to communicate with Active Directory. Maybe I want to query Active Directory from within SQL Server. Before SQL 2005, you couldn't do that. It was nearly impossible, but now you can. So some of these things have really XP command shell becomes less important every release of SQL Server.
Is CLR turned on by default?
No. The question was, is CLR turned on by default? The CLR is off by default. Maybe just a side comment on that. When it was first introduced, most DBAs were terrified of it because they didn't know what it was going to do. But honestly, CLR has not really been adopted that much in the real world. The most likely use case I can think of is talking to Active Directory. And maybe you want to call a web service, maybe. But if you're doing it from inside of the database, why not just do it in your .NET program, right? I'm not a developer, but those are the two use cases I can think of. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, SQL injection. Uh-oh. Yeah, so we've all heard of this, right? As security professionals, I'm sure you've heard about it. Still #1 on the OWASP top 10 list of potential significant application vulnerabilities. And I'm going to put my DBA hat on, and I'm going to say blame the developers. But not really. We all have to work together as a team, and we all have to figure out the best way to secure our databases. But in reality, it kind of is an application development problem. What it basically is you're not sanitizing your inputs correctly on a web-based application, whether that be ASP.NET, Java, whatever. You're not basically if I think there's going to be an integer in that field, you're not checking that there's an integer, or you're not basically you're doing string concatenation on all of my fields in my web application, and then I can just put in a comment. And you're smiling. You can put comments in. I didn't.
Bobby dropped it.
Yeah, little Bobby dropped it. If there's the XK CD comic, I should have put it on here, but. Yeah. So basically, if you have a poorly written application that does string concatenation, you can basically hit the database. And if the code hits the database, it's already over. You've lost. There are a lot of malicious. Well, I wouldn't say malicious. There are a lot of good tools out there to test for SQL injection. Obviously, like all tools, they can be used for both good and evil. But I didn't include them here, unfortunately. I had them on my other slide deck, but just Google on free source. But I will also comment, though, if you're at work and you're downloading these types of tools, that might alert management and your security people in a hurry. So you might want to let, if you're authorized to look at these tools, you might want to make sure that management is aware that you're going to be doing that. So, but yeah, just an FYI on that. Or download it at home. Okay, so service account overprivilege. This is, I would say this is probably the number one. This is very common in the wild. I see this all the time. Hopefully, you're not running your SQL servers as domain admins. Please, no. Please, you don't need to do that. Common misconception that the administrative service account has to be in the local administrators group on that server. It does not. Starting with SQL Server 2005, that was true back in SQL 2000 days. Starting with SQL Server 2005, it is no longer required. Another one that's common misconception is that my SQL agent account. SQL agent is basically Windows Task Scheduler on steroids. It has additional functionality, alerting, management infrastructure, that type of thing. It's a job engine for SQL Server. But there's a common misconception that that account actually has to be in the local administrators group as well. And that the documentation is actually misleading on that. It does not. However, it does need to be in the sysadmin group because it needs to be able to restart SQL Server if for some reason it would fail. The best approach really on older versions of SQL Server is a normal domain user.
You don't even have to do that. I've been popping them out of domain users group.
Okay.
Putting them in a dummy service group that has no permissions.
Okay, so the question was you don't even need to use a domain user. Okay. A local user on the server, right?
They're just, they're a local user, but not domain users.
Okay, excellent point. Thanks for contributing that. The problem with that approach is if you use agent and you need to connect to some sort of network resource, then you can't.
Yeah, you're still being granular and you're giving them access to what they need over there, but that's used that you can't hijack that account and start accessing desktops or
Right.
servers.
What was your question?
I was just saying, if you have one box trying to talk to another box, you make sure that just those two boxes have that local.
That would work as well. That would work as well. Any other questions on it?
Still, no, use a domain account, but make local users there. You don't have to replicate the account. Well, it's like if you're back in management. That's what How about in a cloud virtualized environment?
The question was, how about in the cloud virtualized environment? I have not done that much with Windows Azure or SQL Azure. SQL Azure is different from on-premise SQL Server in that it takes that database management layer away from you as a user of that product. And basically, you only get one or more databases that you request. So there isn't really a service account. I mean, yeah, you can install SQL Server on a VM up in Azure, yes. But if you're talking about the product that's known as SQL Azure, which is up in the cloud. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. But in modern versions of SQL Server, starting with SQL Server 2008 R2, by default, it uses something called a virtual account, which is a feature of the Windows, modern versions of Windows. The idea that we're separating our services out. It's a virtual account on the box. Has anybody heard of MSA or managed service accounts? A couple of you? Okay. Here's the cool thing about MSAs. What a managed service account is, it's a service account without a password. Okay? The domain controllers keep track of the password. You don't ever have to worry about it. Okay? So starting with SQL Server 2012 on Server 2008 R2 or newer, you can use managed service accounts to manage to use as a service account with no password to ever change ever. There's a caveat with that. You cannot use managed service accounts on a failover cluster because the service account has to be assigned to one specific box, installed on one box. So it doesn't work on failover clusters. There's something called GMSA, or group managed service accounts. Here, okay? Group managed service accounts that started for the first time in Windows Server 2012. The problem with that is that Microsoft does not officially support them with SQL Server. I know that people have used them, and they work. Basically, a group managed service account gives you the ability to have one service account for multiple boxes, like a failover cluster. And then basically, it's all the goodness of an MSA to be able to use on multiple boxes. Microsoft does not officially support that with SQL Server 2012 or SQL Server 2014. And it's really, really cool. But I had a conversation, I was at the PASS Summit last month, and I actually, quite by accident, I sat down at a lunch, the security table at one of the luncheons, and I ended up talking with one of the security team leads, basically, at Microsoft. I said, so what's the deal with GMSAs? How come you guys won't support them? Because they've been filing connect items as why won't you support GMSAs? And he said, all right, well, here's the deal. My security team, this is like 2 years ago, they got pulled off to go work on Windows or SQL Azure, and they haven't had time to get back to do the final acceptance testing to actually validate that, yes, they do work. I can tell you, I know people who have used them and they work fine, but they're not officially supported. So just FYI on that. Okay, so secure handling of backups. This is an interesting one. So let's imagine I've got a database called ERP, and it could be anything. But most DBAs like to back up to a local file system as a formatted file save. And we'll just call it dbackups erp.back. It's a file on disk, okay, a Microsoft Virtual Tape file format. And then most likely, you've got some sort of commercial backup solution running on your box, like a file agent. I'm gonna use Commdata, or Commvault, but and there's lots of other ones. That's just the one that I have the most experience with. And then it might go to a tape, or it goes to some sort of SAN solution. And if it's, let's say, pretend that it goes to tape, for example, maybe it goes into a lockbox on site somewhere, in your computer room or data center or whatever. And then maybe a guy comes maybe once a week, and he signs out maybe from Iron Mountain or there's various other vendors, Cintas. He takes that box and he puts it in his truck, and then he takes it to a secure storage facility where it comes back for. It comes back on a periodic basis, okay? And that's the secure storage. But so anybody see any problems with this approach? So first of all, are you encrypting? First question to ask is, are you encrypting your backups? Because the data that's on that file is readable, okay? It's a Microsoft Virtual Tape file format, okay? Starting with SQL Server 2014, you have the ability to do native encryption on your backups right within the database engine. Very, very cool stuff. So then the second question is, where are you encrypting your backups? Are you doing it with that third-party commercial backup software solution? That's probably the most likely scenario. Ask your question, who has access to those tapes? Who are the people who are authorized to go change those tapes out of the autoloaders or whatever devices you're using? And then finally, who has access to the backup console, the third-party backup software solution that whatever it is that you're using. If it's a disk-based SAN type backup, who has access to the SAN? Right? You're probably your SAN administrators, right? These are all things to ask yourselves in terms of controlling those backups and making sure those backups don't leak out into the wild. And who has access to the box? When I say box, I mean the secure locked box where your tapes might live in. And then finally, is the truck secure? That's the guy who takes your tapes to that secure storage facility. Okay, backup encryption. I already mentioned this. If you were using TDE or transparent data encryption on a database, this was previously a side effect. You got it whether you wanted it or not. Okay, but in 2014, we can actually explicitly say, I want to do that. There's a lot of third-party backup software out there. I've just listed some of them because these are the most common ones. The first three are more SQL Server focused. They do the backup encryption before it hits disk. The second one is more of a general purpose backup software that has functionality to connect to SQL Server. Okay, Adhoc Access. This is I don't know how big of a deal this is. This is something that concerns me, or that I've looked for in the past. If you've got ad hoc access turned on, you could run a trace and look for these calls to what's called open data source, which means go connect to another SQL server somewhere else and do something. Okay, and an open row set, which basically does pretty much the same thing. So if you see that being used in your environment, go and look in that code for hard-coded usernames and passwords. Hopefully they're not there, but you might be surprised. Finally, Kerberos Authentication. This is a little-known fact that you have to specifically configure and provision your service account to use Kerberos Authentication with Active Directory. Otherwise, SQL Server will run in NTLM v2 authentication. There's a command called setSPN, and basically you tell it's a Windows utility. You tell Active Directory that I'm registering this specific instance of SQL Server on this specific port, and we're going to bind that to the service account so that we can use Kerberos Authentication. That's the mutual authentication. If you're using managed service accounts, you can configure it in there as well. All right, so this is the last one, securing your dev and QA environments. I have found that typically dev and QA are generally not as secure as production, which is unfortunate. But the question is, generally a lot more people have access to dev and QA than they do in production. Is there any PII, personally identifiable information, or PHI if you're in the healthcare business in those databases? I don't know. But those are questions to look for and questions to ask your DBAs and things to talk about. Are you obfuscating sensitive data? There are some products on the market today that you can use to run against your databases that will anonymize and randomize your data so that you can mask that personally identifiable information. All right, so wrap up. Configured correctly, SQL Server, I believe, is pretty secure. You definitely use auditing. There's lots of different functionality or lots of different solutions you can use there. Encrypt your data wherever possible, however possible you can. Periodically review members of your sysadmin group in SQL Server because those are highly privileged accounts. Disable unused logins that are not actually being used. You can actually disable it without deleting it. There's a button you can just say disable this account. And then also watch for service account over provisioning. Very common. And finally, review your backup chain of custody. Who has access to your backups? And then finally, secure your dev and QA environments as well. All right. Thanks, everybody. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
What were the names of those methods that you said could probably lead to hard-coded credentials? They may lead to hard-coded credentials, maybe, depending on how they're configured. Open data source and open row set. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned the double hop situation, and I was wondering if you had any advice on how to mitigate it.
The what situation?
Double hop.
Oh, the double hop. You can configure the SQL Server service account for Kerb to run using Kerberos. And there are a couple other configuration things you need to do, but if you do configure it that way, SQL Server will pass those credentials, those Windows credentials. Yes, sir.
You have to come look at the photo, though. I want to know if you have any suggestions for this.
Okay. Backup tape sitting outside of the safe. That's classic. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me.